The first thing he remembers is the sound. Not the explosion that took his arm, not the shouts on the radio, but the echo of rotor blades pushing hot Panamanian air through shattered windows as his squad moved down a narrow street in Panama City, December 1989, under the orange glow of burning buildings. Somewhere above, Black Hawk and Little Bird helicopters circled, their silhouettes cutting across the night sky, while in the distance the heavy thump of AC-130 gunships rolled like thunder over the city. Operation Just Cause had officially begun hours earlier. But for him, the war was starting right here, in this cramped urban canyon where every window could hide an enemy, and every shadow might flicker with muzzle flash. He was a young infantryman, barely in his 20s, deployed as part of the U.S. invasion to oust General Manuel Noriega and dismantle the Panama Defense Forces. And on that night, he still believed that training and tactics would be enough to carry him through. He had no idea that before the sun rose, the price he would pay for that belief would be his right arm. The mission brief had sounded clinical back at the staging area, far from the chaos of the streets. Their unit's task was to secure a sector near Panama City's dense residential neighborhoods, not far from key military and police installations that U.S. planners considered crucial to Noriega's control. The invasion had been designed with overwhelming force: airborne assaults on strategic airfields, strikes on command centers, and rapid moves against barracks and headquarters of the Panama Defense Forces, known as the PDF. But on the ground, in the narrow streets and cinderblock houses of the capital, the neat arrows on briefing maps dissolved into a maze of alleys, balconies, and power lines. Intelligence reports warned of PDF regulars, paramilitary dignity battalions loyal to Noriega, and armed civilians who might resist. Still, he was certain of one thing. His squad would move together, follow doctrine, clear buildings methodically, and bring each other home. He checked his rifle again, feeling the weight of the weapon and the ceramic plates in his vest, and told himself that this would be another operation. Dangerous but manageable. Yet nothing about Panama felt manageable the moment they stepped off the vehicles and into the humid midnight air. The city seemed alive, but not in any way he recognized. Fires burned in the distance from earlier strikes and clashes. Glass littered the sidewalks. Dogs barked and cars sat abandoned, doors hanging open as if people had vanished mid-errand. Somewhere nearby, a woman was crying, her voice cutting through the low rumble of engines and intermittent gunfire. The rules of engagement and the neat conceptual language of neutralizing hostiles clashed with the reality that this was not an empty battlefield, but a city full of families caught between soldiers. As they advanced, the squad moved in a staggered column, hugging walls, stopping at intersections, eyes scanning windows and doorways. At each corner, the veteran, back then just a private with a nervous smile and newly issued gear, felt the pull between fear and adrenaline. The fear whispered that one wrong step, one unseen shooter, could end his life without warning. The adrenaline urged him forward, reminding him of his training, of the comrades at his side, of the mission they had been told would be swift and decisive. He had known, in an abstract way, that the United States was using overwhelming firepower. Briefings mentioned precision strikes, night vision dominance, and the advantage of surprise. But in the tight confines of the city, that power felt distant and almost irrelevant. Tanks and armored vehicles could not squeeze down every alley or thread under every balcony. Helicopters could not see behind every curtain. In this environment, the urban fight belonged to the infantry, one doorway at a time. His platoon leader had emphasized that the enemy knew these streets and rooftops far better than any map could show. In some districts, the PDF had trained and patrolled for years. They knew the dead ends, the shortcuts, the blind spots. The veteran's job, he had been told, was to move, to stay alert, to cover his sector, to trust the man in front of him and the one behind. Simple words that carried a terrible weight when the first rounds cracked not far ahead, snapping into plaster and concrete. Those initial shots changed the air. The city, already tense, seemed to shrink even further around them. The squad hit the ground or tucked into doorways, hearts racing as fragments of masonry rained down. Someone shouted contact. Someone else yelled for a direction. The veteran, pressed against a wall, could feel the vibrations of each shot through the brick at his back. His training took over, but his senses were overloaded. The smell of dust and burnt trash, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the chorus of voices on the radio blending with distant explosions. From an upper floor, a muzzle flash flared, then vanished as quickly as it appeared. The squad's machine gunner returned fire, short controlled bursts that lit the street with yellow streaks. The mission had become real in an instant, and any illusion that this would be a clean, orderly operation disappeared with the first burst of incoming rounds. In the days and weeks that followed, though in his memory it often feels like a single endless night, the invasion of Panama would be recorded as a swift campaign that toppled Noriega's regime in a matter of days. Official accounts would highlight the precision of airborne assaults, the capture of key facilities, and the reduction of organized resistance. Yet at the small unit level, especially in the urban sectors of Panama City and nearby towns like Colón, the conflict was messy, intimate, and deadly. For young soldiers like him, this was not an abstract geopolitical maneuver, but a series of doorways, stairwells, intersections, and split-second decisions. He would later learn that historians would debate the legality and necessity of the operation, and that human rights organizations would document civilian casualties and the long-term impact on Panamanian neighborhoods. In those first hours on the ground, however, none of that was in his mind. All he could think about was the next corner, the next rooftop, and the next command shouted over the radio. He had joined the army for reasons that now felt distant, a mixture of patriotism, restlessness, and the promise of a steady paycheck had drawn him in. Before Panama, his world had been made up of training ranges, barracks, and the rare quiet weekend off base. He had fired blanks in exercises, rehearsed room clearings on plywood mock-ups, and run through endless drills of reacting to contact and evacuating casualties. There were instructors who had fought in Vietnam, men who spoke in low, matter-of-fact tones about ambushes and booby traps in jungle villages. But there was always a gap between their memories and his expectations. He believed he could learn from them, but he also believed, without fully realizing it, that modern gear, better communications, and improved tactics would spare his generation some of that horror. Panama taught him how fragile that belief really was. By the time his unit was ordered into the heart of the city, he had already heard rumors about firefights at the Comandancia, Noriega's headquarters, and clashes near military barracks and police stations. Some said the PDF had melted away in certain areas, while others insisted there were still pockets of determined resistance, including paramilitaries who knew they could not expect mercy if captured. The veteran listened to snippets of radio traffic that hinted at casualties. Medevacs requested, streets described as hot, intersections marked as no-go zones. Every fragment of information sharpened his awareness that the bullets flying tonight did not care about ideals or politics. They simply tore through flesh and bone, indifferent to doctrine, nationality, or training. The block where his squad was headed had already seen fighting earlier. Burned-out vehicles sat at odd angles, some slammed into walls as if the drivers had tried to escape too late. A shopfront's metal shutter was riddled with holes, curled back like torn foil. Overhead, power lines sagged. The smell of something chemical hung in the air, mingling with smoke and sewage. As they moved in, the squad leader reminded them to watch for crossfire, to avoid bunching up, to coordinate their fields of fire. His voice, usually relaxed, held a tight edge now. The veteran could hear it, and he felt the tension pass down the line like static. He gripped his rifle a little tighter, the fabric of his gloves damp against the handguard. Inside one of the buildings, the world narrowed to stairwells and door frames. Urban warfare manuals talked about clearing rooms, controlling vertical space, and using grenades or flashbangs to disorient defenders. But reality rarely matched the diagrams. Hallways were cluttered with furniture and personal belongings. Photographs hung crooked on the walls. A children's toy lay abandoned near a doorway. Every object became a question. Had the family fled in a panic, or were they still hiding in some back room, listening to boots and foreign voices echo through their home? The veteran moved as he had been trained, slicing the pie at corners, muzzle steady, scanning. But he could not shut out the human details around him. They pressed against his sense of purpose and made the mission heavier, more complicated. When they emerged onto a higher floor balcony overlooking the street, he caught his first clear glimpse of what lay ahead. Several blocks down, another American element was moving, dark shapes sliding from doorway to doorway. Somewhere above them, tracer rounds arced through the sky, someone firing from a building further up. The city's layout was betraying them, revealing their movement to anyone watching from higher ground. The veteran realized that the promise of superior technology, night vision, radios, air support, could not fully compensate for the defenders' advantage in terrain. The enemy did not need to control the whole city. They only needed a handful of well-chosen vantage points to make each American step dangerous. That night, the veteran's squad was tasked not only with moving through the streets, but also with securing a key intersection that offered access to several important routes. Control of intersections in urban operations is critical, because they determine how forces can maneuver, reinforce, or withdraw. Losing one could mean isolating friendly units or exposing them to fire from multiple directions. Securing it meant stepping into a place where sightlines converged, where snipers, machine guns, or improvised barricades could turn an open space into a killing ground. As they approached, the squad leader signaled them to slow, to spread out, to use whatever cover they could find. Cars, corners, low walls, anything that would conceal their silhouettes. Even before the ambush, he felt a prickle at the back of his neck, a sense that the night had shifted against them. They had grown used to the irregular rhythm of distant gunfire, short bursts followed by silence. But as they closed on the intersection, the air seemed to hold its breath. There were no dogs barking, no shouted voices, no clatter of debris kicked aside. Just the faint hum of a generator somewhere, and the ringing in his own ears. The veteran's eyes swept windows, balconies, and rooftop lines, searching for movement, a glint of metal, anything. He saw laundry hanging stiffly, curtains shifting slightly in the hot air, and a dark doorway that seemed a little too perfectly shadowed. Later, after the hospital and the surgeries and the long, quiet nights replaying everything, he would assign meaning to these details. He would tell himself he had sensed something, that some part of him knew what was coming. In truth, the human mind is almost desperate to find patterns in chaos, to claim it saw the storm forming before it broke. At that moment, all he really knew was that his heart was beating hard, that his breathing sounded too loud inside his helmet, and that every step into that intersection felt heavier than the last. He had no way to know that within minutes, a blast would tear through the street, that his world would turn white and red and silent, and that when he woke again, his right arm would be gone. But he did know something else, something simpler and more immediate. He was not alone. Around him moved men whose faces he had come to know intimately over months of training. There was the squad joker who always found a way to make someone laugh before a long march. The quiet one who wrote letters home every Sunday without fail. The sergeant who never seemed rattled, not even when everything went wrong, who could fix a jammed weapon or a broken spirit with equal patience. They were not just a unit. They were the fragile net that held each other over the abyss of fear. The veteran drew strength from their presence, from the knowledge that they would do everything they could to keep him alive, just as he would for them. That sense of brotherhood was perhaps the only constant he could cling to in those streets. History would eventually reduce the invasion of Panama to timelines and statistics. The dates in December 1989, the number of troops deployed, the approximate casualties on each side, the political fallout and international reactions. There would be debates about whether the operation was justified, whether civilian lives could have been better protected, whether it truly achieved its stated goals. For the veteran, however, the meaning of that night was far more personal. It became the dividing line between the life he had before, a life with two arms, with all the casual assumptions of youth, and the life he would build afterward, marked by absence and adaptation, but also by memory and responsibility. He carried not just the physical scars, but the stories of those who did not come home, and the knowledge that every statistic in a history book represented someone's child, sibling, or friend. As he tells his story now, decades later, the details remain vivid. The way the streetlights flickered, the echo of his own boots on cracked pavement, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. He can recite the sequence of events as best he remembers it, but he also acknowledges the gaps, the moments blurred by shock and pain. Memory, like urban combat, is uneven terrain, full of blind corners and sudden drop-offs. What matters to him is not just how he lost his arm, but what that loss came to represent. The cost of decisions made far from the front, the resilience demanded of those who survive, and the obligation he feels to speak for those who never had the chance to grow old and tell their own version. And this is where you come in. These stories of real people and real battles, however controversial the wars around them may be, are threads in a larger fabric of memory that can easily fray if they are not shared and listened to. Hearing a veteran recall the night streets of Panama City, the confusion of urban combat, the split second that changed his body forever, connects the past to the present in a way no statistic ever could. Before moving on to the next part of this story, the moment the ambush erupts, the blast that takes his arm, the desperate scramble to stay alive, take a second to think about your own connection to history. From where are you listening to this story? And how old are you today? If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. Your presence keeps these memories alive, and your support helps carry the voices of real veterans and civilians to more people who might otherwise never hear what war truly feels like up close. The explosion came without warning, as they always do. One moment the veteran was moving through the intersection, rifle raised, scanning a second-story window where he thought he'd seen movement. The next moment the world turned inside out. A blinding white flash erased every detail. The buildings, his squad, the night sky, and replaced them with a pressure wave that felt like being hit by an invisible freight train. His body lifted off the ground, weightless for a fraction of a second, and then slammed back down onto broken asphalt with a force that knocked every bit of air from his lungs. The sound came after, a rolling concussive roar that seemed to echo inside his skull, drowning out everything else. He couldn't hear the shouts of his squad mates, couldn't hear the gunfire that erupted immediately after the blast, couldn't even hear his own voice trying to scream. All he could hear was a high-pitched ringing, a continuous whine that swallowed the world. For several seconds, maybe longer, he would never be sure, he lay on his back, unable to move, unable to think. His vision was filled with swirling black spots and flashes of color that had nothing to do with what was actually in front of him. His brain struggled to process what had happened. An improvised explosive device, someone would tell him later. Likely a command-detonated mine or a rigged artillery shell, hidden beneath debris or inside a vehicle near the intersection, triggered by a PDF fighter watching from one of the surrounding buildings. The Panamanian Defense Forces and the paramilitary Dignity Battalions had prepared for an American assault, and while they could not match U.S. firepower in open battle, they could turn the city itself into a weapon. Choke points like intersections became natural kill zones where small groups of defenders could inflict disproportionate damage on advancing forces. The tactical doctrine that U.S. forces brought to Panama emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence of action. Air assault elements had seized airfields at Torrijos Tocumen and Rio Hato in the opening hours, while armored columns and infantry moved to encircle key facilities like the Comandancia in downtown Panama City. The plan called for rapid neutralization of organized resistance, preventing Noriega's forces from mounting a coordinated defense. But doctrine, no matter how well conceived, struggles in the chaos of urban combat. Buildings channel movement into predictable routes. Civilians complicate rules of engagement. Communications break down when walls and structures block radio signals. And most critically, the defender can prepare the battlefield in advance, placing obstacles, booby traps, and ambush positions exactly where attacking forces are most vulnerable. The intersection where the veteran squad was hit had likely been surveyed and prepared days or even weeks before the invasion, turned into a trap waiting to be sprung. When his vision started to clear, the first thing he saw was smoke. Thick, acrid smoke that stung his eyes and throat, rolling across the ground in waves. He tried to lift his head and immediately felt a wave of nausea so intense he thought he would vomit. His body felt wrong, disconnected, as if the wiring between his brain and his limbs had been severed. He tried to push himself up with his right arm and felt nothing. No resistance, no pain, just a terrible absence. Confused, he turned his head to the right and saw his shoulder, his upper arm, and then, nothing where his forearm and hand should have been. Just a ragged, bleeding stump wrapped in shredded fabric and exposed tissue. The shock was so complete that for a moment he felt no pain at all, only a cold, detached curiosity, as if he were looking at someone else's body. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. Then the pain arrived. Not all at once, but in surging, nauseating waves that made him gasp and grit his teeth. It was not the sharp, clean pain of a cut or a burn, but something deeper and more fundamental. A signal from his body that something catastrophic had happened. Something that could not be fixed by bandages or willpower. He tried to reach across with his left hand to apply pressure, to do something, anything, but his left arm wasn't responding correctly either. Later he would learn that shrapnel had torn through his shoulder and chest, that his body armor had saved his life but couldn't protect his limbs, that the blast had riddled him with fragments of metal, concrete, and glass. At that moment, all he knew was that he was bleeding, badly, and that he needed help. Around him, the intersection had become a nightmare. The explosion had caught at least 2 other members of his squad. One lay motionless a few meters away, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Another was crawling, dragging one leg behind him, leaving a dark smear on the pavement. The rest of the squad had scattered, diving for cover as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The ambush had been carefully planned. The IED to shock and wound, followed immediately by small arms fire from elevated positions to pin down survivors and prevent rescue attempts. Muzzle flashes sparked from windows and rooftops, and the distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds snapped through the air. The veteran could see tracer rounds arcing overhead, green and red streaks that crisscrossed the smoke-filled intersection. His squad leader, a staff sergeant with 2 previous deployments and a reputation for staying calm under fire, was shouting into the radio, calling for immediate casevac and fire support. The veteran could barely hear him over the ringing in his ears, but he could see the sergeant's face, streaked with dust and blood, eyes wide with the kind of controlled panic that comes when you realize your people are dying, and you have seconds to make decisions that will determine who lives and who doesn't. The sergeant crawled toward the veteran, keeping low, moving in short bursts between cover. When he reached him, his eyes went immediately to the missing arm. For just a fraction of a second, the sergeant's face showed raw horror, but then training took over. He pulled a tourniquet from his kit and began wrapping it around the veteran's upper arm, just below the shoulder, yanking it tight with a force that made the veteran scream. The tourniquet was a simple device, a strap and a windlass, but in that moment, it was the difference between life and death. Arterial bleeding from a traumatic amputation can drain a human body of blood in minutes. The veteran's heart was pumping hard from adrenaline and shock, which only accelerated the blood loss. The sergeant twisted the windlass, tighter and tighter, until the flow of blood slowed to a trickle. The pain was excruciating, a burning, crushing agony that made the veteran's vision go white at the edges, but it also meant his body still had enough blood pressure to feel pain, which meant he was still alive. The sergeant secured the windlass, marked the time on the veteran's forehead with a grease pencil, a crude but effective method to let medics know when the tourniquet was applied, and moved to check the other casualties. The firefight continued around them, a chaotic exchange of fire that measured distance not in meters but in heartbeats. Every second that passed without effective suppression of the enemy shooters was another second that wounded men lay exposed in the intersection, bleeding out while rounds snapped past their heads. The squad's machine gunner had found a position behind a low wall and was returning fire in controlled bursts, trying to keep the enemy's heads down. Another soldier was throwing smoke grenades, trying to create a screen that would allow them to drag the wounded to cover. Purple and gray smoke began to billow across the intersection, mixing with the dust and debris, creating an eerie, otherworldly fog that obscured vision but also offered concealment. The veteran felt hands grabbing his gear, dragging him backward across the pavement. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, and he wanted to scream at them to stop, to leave him alone, but he couldn't form the words. His throat was dry and clogged with dust. All he could do was gasp and try not to pass out. He focused on small things, the rough texture of the asphalt scraping against his back, the rhythm of the gunfire, the sound of his own breathing. He told himself that if he could still feel, still hear, still breathe, then he was alive. And as long as he was alive, there was a chance. They dragged him into a doorway, a narrow alcove that offered some protection from the direct line of fire. 2 other wounded soldiers were already there, one holding a bandage against his neck, blood seeping between his fingers, the other unconscious with a makeshift splint on his leg. The medic appeared, a young specialist with barely a year in the army, but hands that moved with surprising steadiness. He checked the tourniquet on the veteran's arm, nodded approval at the sergeant's work, and then began cutting away the veteran's gear and uniform to assess other injuries. The medic's face was a mask of concentration, his lips moving silently as he ran through mental checklists. Airway, breathing, circulation, bleeding. He found shrapnel wounds in the veteran's shoulder, side, and leg, packed them with gauze, and wrapped them with pressure bandages. Every touch sent lightning bolts of pain through the veteran's body, but he bit down and tried not to move. The concept of golden hour in combat medicine refers to the critical window of time in which a severely wounded soldier has the best chance of survival if he receives definitive medical care. In Vietnam, that window was often measured in hours due to the challenges of jungle terrain and medevac availability. By 1989, advances in helicopter medevac and forward surgical teams had shortened response times, but in urban combat like Panama, other obstacles emerged. Helicopters couldn't always land in hot zones where enemy fire was still active. Ground ambulances couldn't navigate streets blocked by debris or controlled by hostile forces. The golden hour could shrink to minutes if the tactical situation prevented rapid evacuation. The veteran's life now depended on his squad's ability to hold their position, suppress enemy fire, and create a landing zone secure enough for a medevac bird to come in. The radio crackled with overlapping voices, the company commander demanding a situation report. Another unit calling in contact at a different location. Air support checking in, asking for grid coordinates and target descriptions. The squad leader, still at the edge of the doorway, firing controlled bursts at suspected enemy positions, was trying to coordinate all of it while keeping his remaining men alive. He called for immediate close air support, but the response was that gunships were already engaged elsewhere, and the nearest available aircraft was 10 minutes out. 10 minutes. The veteran heard that and felt something cold settle in his chest. 10 minutes was an eternity. In 10 minutes, a man with a severed limb could bleed out even with a tourniquet if internal injuries were severe enough. In 10 minutes, the enemy could maneuver closer, throw grenades into their position, or call in reinforcements of their own. The urban battlefield is a three-dimensional chessboard where advantage shifts constantly. The Panamanian fighters, though outgunned and outnumbered overall, held key advantages in this specific engagement. They knew the buildings, the angles, the routes of withdrawal. They could shoot and move quickly, using interior stairwells and passages that the Americans couldn't see or target without entering the buildings themselves. And they knew that time was on their side. The longer they kept the Americans pinned, the more likely reinforcements would arrive, or the Americans would make a mistake, or the wounded would die before help could reach them. It was not a fight for territory in any grand strategic sense. It was a fight for time and blood, measured in seconds and heartbeats. The veteran's awareness began to flicker, moments of clarity interspersed with darkness. He could hear voices, but they seemed to come from far away, distorted and echoing. He felt cold, despite the humid Panamanian heat, a bone-deep cold that came from blood loss and shock. His body was shutting down non-essential systems, diverting what little blood remained to vital organs. The medic was talking to him, asking him questions. "What's your name? Where are you from? Stay with me. Keep your eyes open." But the veteran couldn't remember the answers. His thoughts scattered like leaves in a wind, fragments that wouldn't cohere into meaning. He thought about his family, his mother's face, a girl he'd dated before deployment. He thought about the soldiers lying in the intersection, whether they were still alive, whether anyone was helping them. He thought about his arm, and wondered absurdly if someone had picked it up, if it was still out there on the street. Time collapsed. He couldn't tell if seconds or hours were passing. At some point, he heard the unmistakable sound of rotor blades, growing louder, a Black Hawk medevac helicopter inbound. The squad leader was on the radio, popping smoke to mark their position, directing the pilot to a small clearing 1 block over where the bird could land. The suppressive fire intensified as the remaining soldiers poured rounds toward enemy positions, trying to create enough of a pause for the evacuation to happen. The medic and another soldier lifted the veteran, each taking a side, and began moving quickly through the smoke and darkness toward the landing zone. Every jostle sent agony through his body, but he was beyond screaming now, beyond anything but a dim, stubborn determination to hold on. The helicopter was a dark shape in the smoke, rotors screaming, side doors open, crew chief waving them in. They ran, stumbling over debris, and practically threw the veteran onto the bird's floor. Other wounded were loaded in beside him, a tangle of bodies and blood and medical gear. The crew chief, a flight medic, immediately began checking tourniquets and starting IV lines, working with practiced efficiency even as the helicopter lifted off and banked hard, gaining altitude and speed. Through the open door, the veteran caught a last glimpse of the intersection, still wreathed in smoke, muzzle flashes still sparking in the darkness. Then the helicopter turned and the city fell away below, a sprawl of lights and shadows and fire. The flight to the field hospital was short, maybe 5 minutes, but those minutes were a blur of pain and fear and the surreal sensation of being suspended between earth and sky while his life drained away. The crew medic worked over him, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, talking to him in a steady, calm voice that cut through the roar of the rotors. He told the veteran he was doing great, that he was going to make it, that the surgeons were waiting and they'd take good care of him. The veteran wanted to believe him, but he could see the concern in the medic's eyes, the quick glances exchanged with the crew chief. He knew he was in bad shape. He knew that survival was not guaranteed, that despite all the training, all the technology, all the medevac helicopters and forward surgical teams, some wounds were too severe, some blood loss too catastrophic. When the helicopter landed at the field hospital, a makeshift facility set up in a secured building with surgical teams flown in specifically for Operation Just Cause, the doors flew open and hands reached in, lifting him onto a stretcher and rushing him inside. The last thing he remembered clearly was the bright overhead lights of the operating room, faces masked and gowned leaning over him, voices giving terse commands, and then the prick of a needle and a slide into darkness that felt like falling into a deep, silent well. He didn't know if he would ever wake up again. He woke to whiteness. Not the violent white of the explosion, but a softer, sterile white. Fluorescent lights, ceiling tiles, hospital walls. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't place where he was or what had happened. Then the pain arrived, rolling through his body in waves that brought back fragments of memory. The intersection, the blast, the blood, the helicopter. He tried to sit up and immediately felt a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm, pushing him back down. A nurse's face appeared above him, her expression professional but kind. She told him to stay still, that he was safe, that he was in a military hospital. He tried to ask questions, but his throat was raw and his voice came out as a croak. The nurse held a cup of water to his lips and let him sip slowly. His right arm was gone. He knew that already, had seen it on the street, but the knowledge became real in a new way when he turned his head and saw the heavily bandaged stump, elevated and immobilized. The finality of it hit him like a second explosion, this one internal and silent. His arm, the hand he'd used to write letters home, to grip his rifle, to throw a baseball as a kid, was simply gone, erased from his body as completely as if it had never existed. The phantom sensations were already starting, tingling, itching, the eerie feeling that his fingers were still there, curled into a fist he couldn't open. His brain, still wired to control a limb that no longer existed, sent signals into the void and received only confusion in return. The surgeon who had operated on him came by later that day, a lieutenant colonel with tired eyes and surgical scrubs still marked with old stains. He explained what they had done. The traumatic amputation had occurred mid-forearm during the blast, but the remaining tissue was so damaged by shrapnel and crushing force that they'd had to amputate higher, just below the shoulder, to give him the best chance at a functional prosthetic fitting later. They had repaired vascular damage, removed fragments of metal and bone, debrided dead tissue, and stabilized him with multiple transfusions. He'd lost nearly half his blood volume before reaching the operating table. Another 10 minutes, the surgeon said quietly, and he wouldn't have made it. The veteran listened to these clinical details with a strange detachment, as if they were talking about someone else's body, someone else's close call with death. But they weren't talking about someone else. This was his body, his life, his future that had been rewritten in a single moment of violence. He was 22 years old, and he would never have 2 arms again. The realization came in stages, each one harder than the last. First, the physical fact. The limb was gone. Then the practical implications. He couldn't tie his boots, couldn't load a magazine, couldn't do 100 small tasks he'd never thought about before. And finally, the existential weight. He was no longer the person he had been when he stepped off the transport in Panama. That version of himself had died in the intersection, and now he had to figure out who this new person, this injured, incomplete person, would become. The hospital was filled with other casualties from Operation Just Cause, men with gunshot wounds, burns, fractures, and traumatic injuries of every kind. The invasion had been declared a success by military and political leadership. Manuel Noriega had been captured after taking refuge in the Vatican embassy. The Panama Defense Forces had been disbanded, and a new government favorable to the United States had been installed. Official U.S. casualties were reported as 23 killed and 325 wounded, though some sources suggested the numbers were higher when including injuries that didn't result in immediate evacuation. Panamanian military and civilian casualties were far more difficult to verify, with estimates ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 dead, many of them non-combatants caught in the crossfire or killed in the intense fighting around the Comandancia and in neighborhoods like El Chorrillo, which had been devastated by fire. The veteran lay in his hospital bed and tried to process the gap between the official narrative of swift victory and the reality he had experienced. Yes, the operation had achieved its strategic objectives quickly. Yes, American forces had demonstrated overwhelming superiority in firepower, mobility, and coordination. But those facts did nothing to explain the intersection, the ambush, the IED that had been waiting for them, or the Panamanian fighters who had known exactly how to turn the urban terrain into a weapon. Victory, he realized, was not a single condition, but a collection of different truths that looked very different depending on where you stood. From Washington, Operation Just Cause was a textbook success. From his hospital bed, missing an arm and watching other wounded men struggle with their own injuries, it looked far more complicated. Physical recovery was measured in small, painful increments. The first time they got him out of bed, just to sit in a chair for 15 minutes, left him exhausted and dizzy. His body had been through profound trauma. Not just the amputation, but the blood loss, the shock, the shrapnel wounds that peppered his torso and legs. Physical therapists began working with him almost immediately, teaching him how to balance without his right arm, how to compensate for the shifted center of gravity, how to perform basic tasks one-handed. It was humiliating and frustrating. Things that had been automatic, getting dressed, eating, washing, now required concentration and adaptation. He spilled water, dropped utensils, struggled with buttons and zippers. Every failure reminded him of what he'd lost. But he was not alone in his struggle. The hospital ward became a community of wounded soldiers, each dealing with his own injuries and adjustments. There was the specialist who'd lost both legs to a landmine, learning to use a wheelchair and already talking about getting prosthetics so he could walk again. The sergeant with severe burns across his back and arms, enduring painful debridement treatments and skin grafts. The private who'd taken a round through the abdomen and would carry a colostomy bag for months while his intestines healed. They shared stories, dark humor, and an unspoken understanding that outsiders couldn't quite grasp. They had all crossed a line that separated the theoretical knowledge of war from the lived experience of it, and that crossing had marked them permanently. The veteran's family flew down to visit him once he was stable enough for visitors. Seeing his mother's face when she walked into the hospital room, the way her eyes went immediately to his missing arm, the way her expression crumpled before she forced it back into composure, was almost harder than the injury itself. She hugged him carefully, as if afraid he might break, and cried quietly against his good shoulder. His father stood at the foot of the bed, jaw tight, struggling with emotions he'd never been good at expressing. They told him they were proud of him, that he was a hero, that everything would be okay. He nodded and said the things he thought they needed to hear, but inside he felt hollow. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose body had been broken by forces beyond his control, and who now faced a future he hadn't chosen and didn't want. The psychological wounds were less visible, but no less real. At night, when the ward lights dimmed and the hospital settled into quiet, punctuated only by monitors and occasional footsteps, the veteran's mind returned to the intersection. He saw the flash, felt the blast, heard the screams and gunfire. He saw his arm on the pavement and wondered again if someone had retrieved it, or if it had been left behind, lost in the chaos of the battlefield. The images played on loop, relentless and vivid, and sleep became something to dread rather than welcome. When he did manage to fall asleep, nightmares took over. He was back in Panama, but this time he couldn't move, couldn't shoot, couldn't do anything but watch as his squad was cut down around him. He woke gasping, disoriented, his heart racing and his phantom hand clenched so tight that the muscles in his shoulder ached. The Army's response to his injury was bureaucratic, but not unkind. He was medically evacuated to the United States within 2 weeks, transferred to a larger military hospital where he would begin the long process of rehabilitation and prosthetic fitting. Before he left Panama, he asked about his squad, about the men who had been with him in the intersection. The squad leader had survived, though he'd been wounded in a subsequent firefight. The machine gunner was fine, already back on duty. But 2 others, the ones who'd been closest to the blast, had not made it. One had died at the scene, killed instantly by the explosion. The other had died during surgery, his injuries too severe, despite the surgeon's best efforts. The veteran absorbed these facts in silence, adding them to the weight he now carried. He had survived, but survival came with the knowledge of who hadn't, and the question of why he'd been spared when others, just as young and just as deserving, had not. Survivor's guilt is a common response to combat trauma, a psychological burden that persists long after physical wounds have healed. The veteran struggled with it through the months and years that followed. He replayed the events of that night endlessly, searching for something he could have done differently, some choice or action that might have changed the outcome. Rationally, he knew the ambush had been beyond his control, that the IED had been placed and triggered by the enemy, that he'd followed his training and done nothing wrong. But rationality has little power over the emotional conviction that he should have seen it coming, should have stopped it, should have been the one who died instead of his friends. The prosthetic process was long and frustrating. Early prosthetics in 1989 were far less advanced than the sophisticated myoelectric devices that would become available in later decades. His first prosthetic was a body-powered device with a harness across his back and shoulder, using cable and mechanical joints to open and close a simple hook. It was functional but clunky, and learning to use it required months of occupational therapy. He had to retrain his body to perform tasks he'd done unconsciously for his entire life: gripping a pen, lifting a cup, turning a doorknob. The prosthetic was hot and uncomfortable in warm weather, and the harness chafed and left marks on his skin. More than once, he considered abandoning it entirely and just learning to live one-handed. But the therapists encouraged him to persist, and gradually he developed proficiency. By mid-1990, less than a year after the invasion, the veteran was medically discharged from the Army with a disability rating and a modest pension. He returned to civilian life with a purple heart, a collection of pills for pain and sleep, and no clear sense of what came next. The job market was not friendly to a young man with one arm and no college degree. He applied for positions and faced awkward interviews where hiring managers tried not to stare at his prosthetic. Some were sympathetic, but ultimately chose other candidates. Some made it clear they didn't think he could perform the physical requirements of the job. He moved back in with his parents for a while, feeling like a failure, struggling with depression and the sense that his life had been derailed before it had really begun. But slowly, with the help of Veterans Affairs counseling and a support group for amputees, he began to rebuild. He enrolled in community college, taking advantage of educational benefits, and discovered an aptitude for working with his hands, or hand, in technical fields. He found work as a technician, learned to adapt his workspace and tools to his abilities, and gradually regained a sense of competence and purpose. He met a woman who saw past his injury to the person he was, and they built a life together. He had children who grew up never knowing him with 2 arms, who treated his prosthetic as just another normal part of their dad. Decades later, the physical challenges had become routine, managed through experience and adaptation. But the memories remained sharp. The intersection in Panama City, the explosion, the faces of the men who died, they were as vivid as ever, archived in a part of his mind that time could not erase. He had learned to live with them, to integrate them into his identity, without letting them define him completely. He was not just a wounded veteran. He was also a father, a worker, a citizen, a survivor who had found a way forward. The invasion of Panama faded from public consciousness relatively quickly, overshadowed by the Gulf War in 1991 and subsequent conflicts. For those who had fought there, however, it remained a defining experience, a chapter written in blood and sacrifice that deserved to be remembered not as a footnote to history, but as a story of real human cost. The veteran became determined to tell that story, to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and to ensure that the intersection where he lost his arm would not be forgotten. The maps have changed. The buildings where he fought have been repaired or replaced. The intersection in Panama City where the IED tore through his squad and took his arm has long since been cleared of debris, the bloodstains washed away by rain and time. New generations walk those streets with no knowledge of what happened there on a December night in 1989, when young American soldiers and Panamanian fighters clashed in the darkness and left behind casualties on both sides. The physical landscape has moved on, as landscapes always do. But for those who were there, those who survived and those who carry the names of the dead, that intersection remains frozen in memory, a permanent marker of the moment their lives divided into before and after. The veteran is in his late 50s now. His hair has gone gray at the temples, and his body carries the accumulated wear of decades lived with compensatory movement patterns that favor his remaining arm. The prosthetics have improved over the years. He uses a more advanced myoelectric arm now, one that responds to muscle signals and offers finer motor control than the crude mechanical hook of his early rehabilitation. But no prosthetic, however sophisticated, can fully replace what was lost. There are still tasks that frustrate him, still moments when he reaches instinctively with a right hand that isn't there, still phantom pains that wake him in the night. The injury is not something he has overcome in any triumphant movie-ending sense. It is something he has learned to carry, to integrate, to live alongside. He thinks often about the men who didn't come home from Panama, whose names are engraved on memorial walls, but whose stories have largely faded from public memory. The two from his squad who died in the intersection, one instantly, one fighting for hours on an operating table, had families who received folded flags and official condolences. They had parents who aged with the knowledge that their sons would never age, never marry, never have children of their own. They had siblings who grew up in the shadow of that absence, and friends who carried guilt for surviving when they hadn't. The veteran feels a responsibility to keep their memories alive, to ensure that they are not reduced to names on a list of casualties, but remembered as the complex, flawed, brave human beings they actually were. Operation Just Cause has been analyzed extensively in military journals and strategic studies. It is often cited as an example of effective joint operations, successful integration of special operations forces, and the application of overwhelming force to achieve rapid regime change. The invasion demonstrated the U.S. military's capability to conduct large-scale combat operations with relatively few American casualties, a capability that would shape planning for future interventions in the 1990s and beyond. From a purely tactical and operational standpoint, the mission accomplished its objectives. Noriega was removed from power, his military apparatus dismantled, and a government friendly to American interests installed. But the veteran has learned, through painful experience, that strategic success does not erase individual suffering, and that the human cost of military operations cannot be measured solely in terms of casualties ratios or mission objectives achieved. For every statistic in a Pentagon report, 23 U.S. service members killed, 325 wounded, there is a story of a family shattered, a life changed forever, a set of questions about meaning and sacrifice that have no easy answers. And for the Panamanian casualties, estimated in the hundreds or thousands depending on the source, there are even more stories that have gone largely untold. Entire neighborhoods scarred by fighting, civilians who lost homes and loved ones in a conflict they did not choose. The veteran has struggled with the political and moral dimensions of the invasion. Was it justified? Did the stated objectives, protecting American lives, restoring democracy, combating drug trafficking, warrant the violence that was unleashed? He has read arguments on both sides, from those who defend the operation as necessary and lawful to those who condemn it as an illegal act of aggression that violated Panamanian sovereignty and caused disproportionate harm to civilians. He has no definitive answer, and he has come to accept that perhaps there is no answer that will satisfy everyone. What he knows with certainty is that the consequences were real and permanent for those who experienced them directly, and that abstract debates about legality and strategy can never fully capture the texture of what it means to lose part of your body in combat, or to watch your friends die in the street. Over the years, he has connected with other Panama veterans through reunions and online groups. They share a bond that outsiders find difficult to understand. Not necessarily a bond of agreement about politics or memory, but a bond forged by shared experience of a specific time and place. Some are proud of their service and view the invasion as a necessary mission successfully executed. Others are more ambivalent, carrying doubts and questions that have only deepened with time. Some struggle with PTSD, substance abuse, or chronic pain. Others have built stable, successful lives while still carrying the weight of what they saw and did. The veteran has found solace in these connections, in the knowledge that he is not alone in his struggle to make sense of what happened and what it means. He has also made efforts to reach out to Panamanian perspectives, reading accounts from civilians who lived through the invasion, and listening to interviews with former PDF soldiers. These encounters have been difficult and complicated. There is no simple reconciliation between the view from the American side, where the invasion is remembered as a brief, successful operation, and the view from the Panamanian side, where it is remembered as a traumatic foreign intervention that killed civilians and destroyed neighborhoods. He has learned to hold both truths simultaneously, that he and his squadmates were young soldiers following orders and trying to survive, and that their presence in Panama City that night was part of a larger action that caused real harm to people who had no say in the political decisions that led to war. The question of heroism troubles him. People sometimes thank him for his service, call him a hero, express admiration for his sacrifice. He appreciates the sentiment but feels uneasy with the label. He does not feel he did anything heroic. He feels he did his job, followed his training, and then got blown up by an IED he never saw coming. The real heroes in his mind are the medic who worked on him under fire, the squad leader who applied the tourniquet that saved his life, the helicopter crew that flew into a hot zone to evacuate casualties. And even then, he wonders whether hero is the right word, or whether it's just another way of simplifying and sanitizing the messy reality of combat, where people act out of training, adrenaline, fear, and loyalty to the person next to them, rather than any grand sense of purpose. What he does believe is that telling these stories matters, not because they provide clear moral lessons or inspire patriotic pride, but because they complicate and humanize our understanding of war. When military interventions are discussed in the abstract, as strategic calculations, geopolitical necessities, applications of force, it becomes easy to forget that real human beings are on the receiving end of those decisions. The veteran story, with all its pain and ambiguity, is a reminder that war is not an abstraction. It is blood and shrapnel and severed limbs. It is young men bleeding out in intersections while others fight desperately to save them. It is families who will never be whole again, and survivors who carry the weight of memory for the rest of their lives. He has spoken to high school and college students about his experiences, not to glorify war, but to convey its reality. He shows them his prosthetic arm, tells them about the blast, describes the hospital and the long rehabilitation. He talks about the friends he lost and the decades he has spent trying to make sense of it all. Some students listen with visible discomfort, unprepared for the rawness of the story. Others ask thoughtful questions about his feelings, his regrets, his thoughts on military service. He does not tell them what to think about war or patriotism or American foreign policy. He simply offers his experience as data, as something to be considered when they form their own opinions about the use of military force. The legacy of Operation Just Cause is complicated and contested. In Panama, December 20th is observed as a day of national mourning, commemorating the victims of the invasion. In the United States, the operation is barely remembered outside of military circles, overshadowed by subsequent wars that lasted longer and cost more American lives. The geopolitical impact is debatable. Noriega was removed, but instability and drug trafficking persisted in the region. Democracy was restored in name, but the political situation in Panama has had its share of corruption and challenges in the decades since. The invasion did not solve the underlying problems it was meant to address. It simply removed one problematic leader and created new conditions that brought their own complications. For the veteran, the legacy is more personal. It is measured not in geopolitical outcomes, but in the life he has built despite his injury, in the children he has raised, in the connections he has maintained with other veterans, and in the memory he preserves of those who died. It is measured in the moments when he chooses to speak about his experience, rather than remain silent, contributing his voice to the historical record so that future generations will know that wars are fought by real people who bleed and suffer and die, not by abstract forces or political slogans. He knows that memory is fragile, and that as the generation that fought in Panama ages and passes away, direct recollection of the invasion will fade. Already, younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan dominate the conversation about modern combat. Panama is becoming history, a footnote in the narrative of American military interventions. But history is not inevitable. It is constructed through the stories we choose to tell and preserve. Every time the veteran shares his experience, with students, with journalists, with fellow veterans, or with anyone willing to listen, he is performing an act of resistance against forgetting. He is insisting that the intersection in Panama City, the blast that took his arm, and the men who died there deserve to be remembered as more than statistics or strategic lessons. This is where you, the listener, become part of that legacy. Stories like this one survive only if they are heard, shared, and valued. The veteran's testimony, and the testimonies of countless others who have experienced the reality of war, are gifts offered to those of us who have not been there, invitations to understand, to empathize, to remember. They ask something of us, not hero worship or political agreement, but genuine engagement with the human cost of decisions made in our name. When you listen to a veteran describe the moment he lost his arm in urban combat, when you sit with the discomfort of that story rather than turning away, you are honoring not just his sacrifice, but the sacrifices of all those who have been caught in the machinery of war. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think or feel something beyond the easy narratives of victory and defeat, then carry it forward. Share it with others who need to hear it. Engage with the difficult questions it raises about intervention, about sacrifice, about the gap between strategic objectives and human consequences. Support the veterans in your own community, not just with platitudes, but with real attention to their struggles with injury, trauma, and reintegration. And most importantly, remember that behind every military operation, every strategic success or failure, are individual human beings whose lives are changed forever in ways that statistics and policy papers can never fully capture. The veteran still dreams about Panama. He still feels the phantom pain in his missing arm. He still carries the faces of the men who died in the intersection. But he also carries something else, a determination to ensure that their deaths and his injury were not meaningless. By telling his story, by refusing to let the memory fade, by insisting that the human cost be acknowledged and honored, he gives meaning to the sacrifice. Not the meaning imposed by politicians or strategists, but the meaning that comes from bearing witness, from preserving memory, from connecting the past to the present, so that future generations might make wiser choices. This is his legacy. This is their legacy. And now, if you've made it to the end of this story, it is part of your legacy too. The question is what you will do with it. Will you remember? Will you share it? Will you let it change how you think about war and the people who fight in them? The veteran cannot answer those questions for you. He can only offer his story, his truth, and trust that somewhere, someone is listening. If that someone is you, if this account of the urban battle that cost him his arm in Panama in 1989 has resonated with you, then honor that connection. Like this video, leave a comment about what this story meant to you. Subscribe to ensure more of these vital testimonies reach wider audiences. And most importantly, never forget that freedom and security, whatever their true costs, are always paid for by real people, with real lives, real families, and real dreams that were interrupted or ended in the service of something larger than themselves. Their memory depends on us. Based on documented accounts of Operation Just Cause and testimonies from veterans of the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, including combat in urban environments of Panama City,